November 16, 1951. Portsmouth Harbor wakes under a cold grey sky, the mist still clinging to the water. On the deck, crewmen move through the haze as HMS Illustrious looms at the anchor, her deck slightly with dew. Captain Dennis Campbell boards the ship, carrying a plain leather briefcase that looks far too ordinary for what it contains. Inside is a single sheet of paper. One quick sketch showing a carrier flight deck set 10 degrees off center. No technical data, no engineering notes, just a diagonal line across a rectangle. To anyone else, it would look like a trivial drawing. Yet that simple angle will soon reshape the way every navy in the world lands its aircraft, and will quietly save more lives than any new missile or radar system of its time. What Campbell knows that morning is already terrifying. Over the past 12 months, the Royal Navy has lost 43 aircraft to landing accidents, 43 machines destroyed, and 17 pilots killed, and dozens more badly injured. Every one of those disasters has happened in the last 30 seconds of flight. That final moment when a 30-ton jet traveling at roughly 140 miles per hour tries to grab an arresting wire on a deck that's rolling with the sea. If the pilot misses, there are only 6 feet before the steel barricade, a mesh designed to protect the rest of the ship by destroying the aircraft. And sometimes it works, and often it fails. And when it fails, it kills. Across the Atlantic, the situation is even worse. In 1951, the United States Navy records 776 Class A mishaps, accidents that destroy aircraft or take lives. That's more than 2 major crashes every single day. The Korean War only amplifies the loss. USS Boxer reports 7 barricade collisions during a single deployment. USS Princeton loses 9 planes in 4 weeks. On a straight deck carriers, a missed wire means one outcome. The aircraft slams into the barrier at the full power or crashes into the parked planes forward, turning the deck into the fireball that can kill dozens in seconds. And the problem lies in the technology gap between the old and the new. Jets have changed everything. The F-9F Panther, one of the Navy's front-line aircraft, lands about 40 knots faster than the propeller-driven Hellcat of the previous decade. Worse, its jet engine takes nearly 7 seconds to spool from idle to full thrust. 7 seconds can mean life or death when its pilot is dropping toward the ocean at 20 feet per second. On older aircraft, pilots could chop the throttle on signal and fall safely into the deck. Jets can't do that. They must stay under power at all the way through the landing, which means they are already committed. If the wires aren't caught, the only thing waiting ahead is steel and fire. Landing signal officers, the men standing near the port side waving bright paddles, try to guide pilots home. But by the time a warning is seen and the correction made, physics has already taken over. Everyone knows the truth. Carrier aviation has hit its limit. The future belongs to jets, but the present is killing their pilots. Navies respond by strengthening barriers, thickening cables, and testing increasingly desperate alternatives. The British developed the so-called fleck deck, a rubber runway intended to catch jets even without the landing gear. Test pilot Eric Brown makes about 40 landings on it. In reports, he calls it fundamentally sound. In conversation, he calls it terrifying. The Americans, meanwhile, pour millions into the Davis barrier, a mechanical web built to stop a 25,000-pound aircraft at full power. When it works, it's a marvel, and when it fails, the damage is catastrophic. The conclusion is very obvious. Bigger and stronger barriers don't prevent crashes. They only can contain them. A few officers began to say aloud what many already suspect. The real flaw isn't in the gear or the pilots, it's in the deck itself. Captain William T. Reshaw writes in a 1945 memorandum that current procedures force all aircraft into a 60-foot impact zone with zero margin for error, an arrangement that is fundamentally incompatible with the jet performance. In a plainer language, these ships were designed for propeller planes that landed slower and could abort at the last seconds. Jets can't. Every landing on a straight deck is a gamble, and until someone changes the geometry, people will keep dying. Dennis Campbell seems the least likely person to change that geometry. Born in 1907, he is a career naval officer turned administrator with no engineering degree and a reputation for meticulous paperwork rather than invention. Now, during the war, he flew slow, outdated swordfish torpedo bombers, and earned the Distinguished Service Cross. Afterward, he was assigned to the Ministry of Supply as a liaison between the Navy and civilian aircraft designers. His job was to sign requisitions and keep development schedules on track. Not to rethink how carriers worked, but Campbell has one habit that sets him apart. He never forgets the funerals. In 1951, he attends the burial of Lieutenant Michael Mick Lithgow, a young test pilot killed when his jet hit the barricade aboard HMS Implacable. Lithgow had been one of the Campbell's students, 23 years old, expecting his first child. His approach was perfect. His speed was perfect. He simply missed the wires by a few feet. The barrier failed and the aircraft disintegrated. Now Campbell watches the coffin lowered and tells his deputy, Lieutenant Commander Nick Goodhart, "This is madness. We are killing them with our own equipment." And most officers would leave that grief behind, but Campbell doesn't. He starts collecting accident reports, talking to landing officers, studying the approach patterns. He isn't an engineer, so he works in pencil and sketches. On a train from Portsmouth to London, he keeps drawing career decks, searching for a way to give pilots even a few more yards of forgiveness. Then the idea comes. If the deck can be made longer and the ship can be made wider, maybe the landing path itself can be. He draws a deck angled 10 degrees to port. That slight offset means a missed approach no longer ends in a barricade. It ends in open sky and ocean. A pilot who misses the wires could push the throttle forward, climbing out and trying again. It is so simple, it almost feels naive. The kind of thing that only non-engineering could imagine. But simplicity is often what everyone overlooks. Campbell decides to present it formally. On August 7, 1951, he gathers senior figures at the Ministry of Supply. Louis Boddington from Farnborough Naval Navy Department, Rear Admiral Slattery, several commanders, and engineering specialists. He lays his sketch on the table and explains the concept. Angle the deck so that missed landing clear the ship instead of colliding with it. The response is immediate and harsh. One officer declares the idea completely illegal, citing international aviation regulations that require all flight operations to align with the vessel's axis. Others argue that an angled deck would make landings impossible. The ship rolls and pitches along its centerline, and any offset approach would then force pilots to flight unprecedented motion and drift. Campbell expects skepticism. He doesn't expect open radical. Then Louis Boddington speaks up. He says, "Show me the math." The room goes quiet. No one has any calculations. No one has ever tested such an idea. Well, then we test it, Boddington continues. We paint an outline and we see what happens. Within weeks, HMS Triumph sails with a white line painted diagonally across its existing straight deck. It isn't a structural change, it's just paint. For 3 weeks, begin in September 1951, pilots practice touch and go landings, treating it the painted outline as the deck edge. The supposed drift problem doesn't appear. Pilots adjust in 1 or 2 attempts. In fact, they quickly realize something unexpected. It's freedom. Lieutenant Peter Chilton writes a letter that he came in too high, floated past the wires, and for the first time he didn't feel like starting to panic. He simply added power and flew away. No barrier waiting ahead, no parked aircraft to hit, just open water and a second chance. By October, the results are undeniable. The angled deck concept works. The question now is whether anyone beyond the Royal Navy will believe it. That challenge falls to Commander Eric Brown, the Royal Navy's chief test pilot, the man who has landed more aircraft types on carriers than anyone in history. In September 1951, he travels to the U.S. Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland, to explain the British experiment. 40 American test pilots fill the room, most of them veterans, with hundreds of carrier landings behind them. Brown begins by asking, "How many of you have ever hit the barricade?" A dozen hands rise. Then he asks, "How many of you know someone who died doing it. Every single hand goes up. Only then does he unfold Campbell's sketch. A deck angled 8 degrees to port. The room erupts. "You want us to land sideways?" someone shouts. "What about the island? The landing officer won't be able to see the plane." The noise is relentless until Brown raises his voice over it. He says, "Every objection you have just shouted, we had to. And then we tested it. When you miss the wires, you don't die. You just go around." And the room falls silent. Commander Harold Buell, respected squadron leader, stands and says that the concept contradicts every rule of carrier operations developed throughout years of war. Brown answers evenly, "I am not asking you to throw away doctrine. I'm asking you to stop dying for a design flaw." Rear Admiral Apollo Southwick, observing from the back, steps forward. He confirms that he has witnessed the British tests aboard HMS Triumph and that the concept works. He recommends similar trials for the U.S. Navy. Now, Admiral Alfred Pride, head of the Bureau of Astronautics, hesitates, then finally agrees, but with a warning. If the experiment causes a single fatality, the project will be terminated and everyone associated with it will answer for it. Authorization is granted. The USS Midway will receive a painted angled deck outline for simulated approaches. No one in the room can yet see how a few white lines on a gray deck will mark the beginning of an entirely new era in naval aviation. December 1951, at the U.S. Naval Air Test Center in Maryland, the Americans finally decide to run their own version of the painted deck experiment. The order comes after a long, tense meeting between Rear Admiral Apollo Southwick and Admiral Alfred Pride. Pride argues that the Navy already has its fix, the Davis barrier, which he proudly calls 98.7% effective. Southwick, who has watched pilots die in front of him, asks quietly, 98.7% of what? The aircraft that actually hit it? What about the men who ditch it in the ocean because they rather crash in the water than into a net of full power? And Pride says nothing for a long time, then signs the authorization for the tests on the USS Midway. And a few weeks later, a fresh white stripe appears on Midway's flight deck. 8 degrees off the ship's centerline. For several days, Navy pilots make simulated approaches, touching down as if that stripe were the real deck edge. And to everyone's surprise, it works even better than the British trials. There are no control issues, no visibility problems, and most important, no accidents. Within 90 days, the success of that test convinces the Navy to take the next step. Modify Anthem into the permanent steel and timber angled deck carrier. By early 1953, Anthem is ready. The new section juts out from the port side like a strange addition, welded into the hull so solidly that it looks as if it had always been there. Every officer on board knows they are part of a gamble that could either change naval aviation or end careers. January 12, 1953, off the coast of Guatemala Bay, Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell brings his F9 F5 Panther into the pattern for approach number 1. He's done his 42 times before on a straight decks, but this is a first on an angled version. He lines up with the new runway. Hears the call, Roger Ball, and glides in. A gust lifts him slightly high. He settles, touches, and skips every wire. 1, 2, 3, 4, all missed. Instinct screams that the barricade should be seconds away, but there is no barricade. He slams the throttle forward. The engine spools up slowly, agonizingly, and then the Panther climbs free into open air. 23 seconds later, he is back on approach. The second time he catches the 3-wire dead center. When Buell climbs down, his hands are shaking. He tells the LSO he hadn't realized how much fear he had been carrying until it was gone. In his memoir, he would call landing on an angled deck sheer bliss. Over the next 60 days, Anthiam's crew runs 1,327 landings, 8 bolters, all recovered safely. No wrecks, no deaths. For comparison, those same 8 missed wires on a straight deck would likely have meant several crashes and a couple of funerals. Statistically, the transformation is staggering. Before 1953, carrier operations average more than 600 serious accidents in a year. More than a half from landings. After angled decks are introduced fleet-wide, mishaps drop by half, and fatal landing crashes fall by almost 80%. The numbers only tell part of the story. Letters start to appear in Campbell's post bag. One of them, from Lieutenant James Davison, is dated March 1953. Davison's Panther comes back from a mission with hydraulic failure. No flaps, 20 extra knots on approach speed. On a straight deck, he would have been ordered to ditch. Instead, he makes 4th try on Anthiam's angled deck, missing the wires each time. On the 5th, he catches the 4-wire at 142 knots. The fastest successful arrested landing ever recorded to that point. He writes to Campbell later that year saying, "Sir, I never met you, but I am alive to write this because you drew that line on a paper when everyone told you it was impossible." By 1955, that line has become standard practice. The Royal Navy fits HMS Ark Royal with the new configuration, while the US builds USS Forrestal, the first American carrier designed from the keel up with the angled deck, steam catapults, and optical landing aids. The French refit Clemenceau, the Australians modify Melbourne, and even the Soviets, after the series of disasters on their own straight deck Vargan, quietly adopt the same principle. Declassified Russian reports decades later show their landing accidents dropping by 68% in 6 months. The transformation spreads so quickly that within 20 years, few pilots even know careers were ever different. Captain John Moore, who flies combat missions from USS Coral Sea during the Vietnam, later totals 947 carrier landings, 62 of them bolters. 62 times, he says, I could have been one more name on the wall. Instead, I just climbed away and tried again. By the mid-1970s, every major navy in the world uses angled decks. What began as a British experiment has become standard geometry. The revolution is complete. The moment is taken for granted. And what of the man who started it? Well, Dennis Campbell never claims ownership. In 1954, he is promoted to Rear Admiral, quietly attends the launch of Ark Royal, and when reporters ask for a quote, he deflects praise toward Louis Boddington and the engineers at the Farnborough. When invited to the commissioner of Forrestal in 1955, he politely declines. He is attending the funeral of a helicopter pilot who once served under him. For Campbell, duty to his people always outweighed publicity. 3 years later, he receives the CBE for the services to naval aviation. The citation is a brief 2 sentences, and he keeps it in a drawer. After retiring from the Navy in 1960s, he joins Hawker Siddeley's as a consultant, contributing to the development of early vertical takeoff aircraft. Colleagues remember that every design meeting ended with the same question from him. What happens if this fails at night in a bad weather? He never accepted the reassurance of statistics. He only cared about the single pilot who might one day run out of luck. Dennis Campbell dies in April 2000 at 92. His obituaries in the Times and the Guardian are polite but short, summarizing a lifetime of service and mentioning the angled deck almost as an aside. What they don't capture is scale. Every carrier landing since 1953 owes something to that 10-degree line he drew on a train. Now, modern carriers, the U.S. Navy's Gerald R. Ford class, Britain's Queen Elizabeth class, and France Charles de Gaulle, India's Vikrant, all carry decks angled about 8 degrees to port. The same geometry Campbell sketched in pencil half a century earlier. Across the American fleet alone, more than 15,000 carrier landings are made each year. Roughly 8% of those are bolters, and around 1,200 missed wire recoveries that once would have been catastrophic. Multiply that over 70 years and the total lives saved reaches into tens of thousands. In 2003, U.S. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Black writes to Campbell's family. He'd flown FA-18s from carriers to over 2 decades. I never met your father, he tells them, but I made 147 carrier landings and bolted 42 times on a straight deck. That's 42 chances to die. Because of him, I got 42 second chances. Campbell's son frames the letter. His father never kept his medals, but he would have kept that. Looking back, it's hard to find another example where such a small, almost accidental insight changed so much. Campbell wasn't an engineer, not a scientist, just a naval officer who refused to accept the phrase, "That's how it is, always been." The angled deck didn't come from a research committee or a billion-dollar program. It came from one man's refusal to let design flaws keep killing the people he cared about. Every time a pilot misses the wires today and throttles up and climbs safely back into the sky, they are flying inside that legacy. One simple sketch, 10 degrees of difference, thousands of lives spared. If stories like this fascinate you, moments where one person's stubborn idea reshapes the history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are plenty more forgotten innovations and near impossible breakthroughs still waiting to be told.